Hello everybody. I know it may seem unusual given the things I get to drive and indeed am now lucky enough to own, but for quite some while I have been hankering after a Japanese minivan, specifically a Toyota Alphard. But those in the know have been telling me for a while now that actually there is another I should really be considering. The Alphard's biggest rival, the Nissan Elgrand. So, is it a car worth considering? Well, today I'm gonna find out. Just in case you have missed my long-serving love affair with the Japanese Minivan, why is it that I'm so enamoured with them? Well, that's because they are simply brilliant. They are fantastic pieces of automotive packaging. You see, here in Britain, and indeed much of the rest of Europe and the USA, we have become ever more obsessed with the SUV. And the simple fact is that certainly here in the southern half of England, they're just not necessary for nearly anybody any of the time. That one day of the year when it snows, well, people don't go out anyway, and when they do, if they do have an SUV, they're on summer tyres and they don't know how to drive in the snow anyway. But the rest of the year, they're driving around in something that's big, compromised in terms of handling, and worst of all, not actually that spacious inside. Of course, the sensible alternative to something like this is an estate car, but there are people for whom, though an estate car might sound like a good idea, it actually isn't enough for them. Either they need more seats, more space, or a combination of both. And that is where the Japanese minivan comes in. On account of the restrictions in Japan around owning cars, they have to be very clever with the space they use. Unless, of course, you earn lots and lots of money, because if you want to have a particularly big or thirsty car over there, you are going to pay lots and lots for it. And so, they have stuff like this. And also the Toyota Alphard, and I should also give mention to the Honda Elysian as well. And though none of them may be the last word in style, they all have their own kind of appeal. Of course, in Europe we do have our equivalents, which would be the Mercedes Viano or V-Class and the Evergreen VW Transporter. Just like those, the party piece of the Japanese vans is their versatility. And in that regard, I think the Elgrand is one of the very best I've seen. Most Elgrands are actually an 8-seater with central lap belts for both of the rear and central rows, but this one is a 7, and I'd actually treat it more like a 6. The centre seats even rotate to allow you to face the rear passengers, ideal for both business meetings and picnics. If you're going away, you can even fold the back into a bed. All of the seats can then be moved or removed easily, with the rear row folding away when not required, but when you don't want to leave it in the garage, giving you extra boot space. And as an added bonus, because these aren't commercial vehicles, unlike a van, they won't be turned away from your local recycling centre. And all of this in a vehicle about 4.8 metres long, or to put it another way, quite a bit shorter than any large Mercedes, BMW or even Jaguar. For some context, the Jaguar XF is 5 metres long. Now, it is quite a big car, but it's also really, for adults, a 4 or maybe 5-seater at a push. This you could happily do a long trip with 6 fully grown adults, and I would think very few complaints. And the good news doesn't stop there. You see, there is a fundamental flaw with the Vito and the Transporter. That is because they are vans that have been effectively turned into cars. And vans are ludicrously overpriced. When you look at a van and you think logically about it, they don't really make any sense being as expensive as they are, because what they are big boxes on wheels with very outdated and low-rent interiors attached to uninspiring diesel engines. And if it was a car, you wouldn't pay anywhere near as much for it as they seem to be able to get away with, because it's a van. And long gone are the days where vans were, yes, a little bit expensive, but they were also unburstable. Nowadays, vans are just as much trouble as anything else. And don't even get me started on the transporter tax if you want to talk about their factory-built conversions. But for both the VWs and the Mercedes, the same thing applies. When they've then built a car out of their van, which is of course much nicer inside, and some people really go overboard, because they are nicer than a van, they of course have to be even more money, meaning that for a, admittedly, very nice minivan, you will be paying 7 Series or S-Class money. That's nuts. These, though, are built from the ground up as passenger vehicles, and sometimes they do utility variants. So in the past there have been taxi and paramedic orientated versions of the Elgrand, the first version of which landed back in 1997. This second generation, the E51, following on from the E50, landed in 2002. It was facelifted in 2004, then again in 2007. This one being an example of that final iteration. It was then replaced with the third generation, the E52, in 2010, which is currently still in service. Another reason, particularly for those on a budget, to go with something Japanese is that they were never really big on the whole diesel thing. And in recent years, this has become even more important, because if you're looking at an old Transporter or V-Class, there's a very good chance it's a diesel, and therefore unlikely to be ULEZ compliant. But because the Japanese stuck with either petrol or hybrid, most of them are, including ones like this, which under the bonnet have a 3.5 litre version of the V6 engine as you would have seen in the 350Z. Here it doesn't make quite as much power, around 240 horses, and torque, I couldn't tell you. The gearbox is a 5-speed torque converter automatic, and you know what, around town and driven normally, it does fine. There's a button down here that says power, and I've just noticed it's actually been enabled the whole time I've been driving. This changes, I believe, the throttle response, but also the way the gearbox works. However, even with foot absolutely welded, I made more noise there, but I've only just about touched the speed limit. Now, you may have been looking at this van and thinking, has that been modified? Well, yes, it's Japanese, of course it has. But the modifications are subtle, and all of them were performed by its current owner, Evan, who is the first person to have it since it was imported about 18 months ago. First up, it's lower, by about 20mm, courtesy of teen dampers and RSR springs. Next up, these wheels, which are not really to my taste. I forget the brand, I thought it was Kranzler's, but that's a pressure washer company. They're Cerberus 2s. They're not cheap, and they are very much the go-to style for this kind of thing. They're just not my sort of thing, but people apparently do like them. It also has a Kakimoto, I hope I'm getting this right, exhaust on it. And I did worry it was going to be a little bit obnoxious, because, you know, you see a blue tinted pipe sticking out the back of something like this and you think, oh no, he wants it to sound like a GTR, doesn't he? Actually, if you told me that exhaust pipe was cosmetic, I'd believe you. I am told there is a very big centre silencer in these, and that, sensibly I think, has been left well alone, because if you gutted it, yes, it would sound a bit more like a 350Z, however, it would drone a lot, and that'd get really annoying. And you know what? It's just not that sort of vehicle. I'm doing about 50 miles an hour currently. The speedo down here has not been recalibrated, in case you were wondering, and so for assistance, Evan has a little GPS-based readout up here in miles per hour, which currently is on the blink. Now, the fact is, with these things, they're actually really not that difficult to drive or park, because they are, well, shed-shaped. They're square. The glass at the back of it is the back of the vehicle. You can see nicely down here, and you've even got the classic Japanese kind of corner curb mirror over there, which I quite like. But this car also has on top of that 360-degree parking cameras, which in 2007 would have been properly space age. Yes, there is a limit to the handling. It's not the most dynamic of things, but you know what? It's fine. The steering's actually quite nice. It's got a decent weighting to it. You can place it, and it's very comfortable, even with the lowering springs on. These wheels are 18s versus the 17s it originally came on, and they did sell these with 18s as well, I think. Don't quote me on that though. There were also a whole bunch of different trim levels to these, which can sometimes be a touch difficult to decipher. There was the XL, which is the full luxury one, complete with leather interior. You then have on the other end of the scale the Rider, which I believe is vaguely equivalent to the Velfire for the Alphard. So it's the sportier, meaner looking one. In fact, a quick search on Auto Trader even showed a few that were Nismo versions, mostly cosmetic, I'm fairly certain. This then sits kind of somewhere in the middle, and you can have it with either a fabric or a leather interior, which this one has, and that is what I'd go for. It is sadly missing these sunroofs that you can get on these that I think would be a must-have, but it does have the optional part-time four-wheel drive system, which I'm told is very useful if you get yourself stuck, as Evan did not so long ago down in the Forest of Dean. That's nice. You can either engage it manually, although I believe it's really intended for low speed, or you can leave it in auto, and there's a little display on the dash to tell you which wheels are currently being driven. When it isn't doing all four of them, it's the rear. Someone apparently has manual swapped one of these and is turning it into a drift van. That must be fun. Now, off camera, I did actually recently drive an Alphard because I really am thinking of buying one. It was a slightly later one, and the generations of the two don't really line up particularly evenly. But one thing I have seen in my search is that you get a lot more value for money with an Elgrand. I think the Alphard is the slightly nicer car. They feel a bit better put together inside, and there's a few features they seem to have that some of the Elgrands don't, air-conditioned seats and the like, but I'm probably just looking in the wrong trim levels. You can also get those slightly later with a regular torque converter automatic, whereas these for 2010 changed to the CVT, and of course no petrolhead likes a CVT. Now, you might occasionally feel a little bit like a mum on the school run, but you know what? There's no shame in that. It's 2024. You can be whoever you want to be, and I love that. And this is the perfect sort of car to go out with a bunch of mates, be they the lads or the girls, and you can do a big trip. I was thinking about buying one of these because every now and again I like to go to a show, and of course if you want to go to a show you want to take some friends, and with this you can take 6 people, you can all buy some overpriced merchandise, and you can all get home in comfort. The fuel economy isn't spectacular. It's a 3.5 litre naturally aspirated V6 pulling something that weighs 2.25 tons. What did you expect? But you know what? If you divide it by the amount of people you can get in it, it probably works out just about okay. You also don't need to fill it with AdBlue or anything like that, and actually a lot of modern diesel vans don't really get the economy that they used to either. At lower speeds around town, over potholes, sharp bridges and the like, you do get the odd crash from the suspension, but you know what, actually I don't think it's really dramatically worse than the Nissan Fuga that I just got out of, which is a far more upmarket car. And actually, if anything, I think because this is a big hollow van, you hear stuff, so that makes it sound a little bit worse than it actually is. Even better, owning one of these in Britain doesn't actually seem like it'd be much of a chore. The Elgrand owners community is incredible. Whenever I go to a Japanese car meet, I'm always impressed at the size and variety of Elgrands out there. It's mad. You don't ever tend to see the same showing for even the Alphard, and certainly not the Honda Elysian, which is also a perfectly decent thing, but yeah, in terms of value, oh, this, I like this a lot. It's really cool. Totally unnecessary, but it's grand. In case you were wondering, the car wings button over here is some sort of GPS-based telematics thing that probably did work when the car was in Japan, but as it's not, it doesn't. One of the reasons that Evan did specifically seek out this, the second facelift of the second generation, is because for these, you can have this system easily converted to English. It costs 150 quid, you write into some bloke, give him your serial numbers, he sends you a disc, you feed it to the system, and voila, it's in English. I think if you're dedicated, you can also change the buttons to read English too, or you could just save some money and learn Japanese instead. For regular maintenance and servicing, Evan simply uses his local, trusted independent, and for stuff like this, I don't see why you wouldn't. The oily bits, though they may be slightly tightly packaged, aren't any different to any number of cars which we did get in Britain, so many of the service parts you can get easily. I mean, the oil is just oil, the filter is just a filter, it's all pretty simple. On the downside, if you are the sort of person that's buying something Japanese because you want to modify it, there aren't really so many parts for these to do that. You kind of got to work with what you've got. Certainly compared to the likes of, say, a 350Z, there's almost nothing available for these, really. And I think now, having driven it, though my initial instinct is still to say that an Alphard would be the one for me, that's probably because I've been looking at the higher end, slightly more expensive and slightly later Alphards, all of which are over £20,000. And the fact is that to get something a little bit like this, you could pay under 10 for something in better condition, lower mileage, later, higher spec. You are looking at over that, but even much later cars, sort of 2015, 2016, with lower mileage on, they seem to be going for like high teens. They are way cheaper than the Toyota equivalent. And therefore cars that, though they're not my first choice, I'm not going to ignore. They're just great. Performance car, it is not. Please, nobody be fooled into thinking this is basically a 350Z with 6 seats, because though it might sound like that on paper, the reality is it's still a minibus with a half-decent engine and a nice enough gearbox, but it's mostly just minibus. There's 40, 50, 60. See what I mean? But that's okay, I don't mind. The action of the brakes is not too bad. The pedals are a little on the soft side, a bit more travel than you might expect, but actually they're nice and easy to modulate. You can certainly drive this with a good degree of professionalism. I'm sure also many of you simply won't believe it, but as a young man I did spend a lot of time driving vans, and this does give me some fond memories, but I'm also well aware of the fact it's actually a much nicer experience. You get a little bit of the wind and cabin noise that you would with a van because, you know, physics, but it is just nicer and better. Every single time I drive one of these, I come away thinking the exact same thing. Why doesn't everybody buy one of these? Him, you should have bought one of these. Her, you should have bought one of these. She definitely should have bought one of these. You could get loads of old people in the back of this. You can stand them up, pack them in like sardines. You could get a whole bingo hall in here. And for less than I bet she paid for that horrid Ford. Anyway, I think that's enough from me. I want to say a big thank you to Evan for bringing his car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.